more of the most anthologized horror stories of all time. I arrived at my list by surveying 250 anthologies, and here's a fraction of my results. In other videos, we'll cover 5 stories at a time, but here today we're doing basically number 6 through 10 of the most anthologized horror stories of all time. And I wanted to talk about these stories kind of out of order because they sort of build on each other. The first one I want to talk about is The Telltale Heart by Edgar Allan Poe. I think if I surveyed by author instead of by specific story, Poe would be the most anthologized writer on my list. The Telltale Heart is a very strange story for its time, even though for our time it seems kind of standard. And by that I mean that Poe's technique of the unreliable narrator, who's a dangerous and nasty person himself, has taken over the world. So many writers have used it since his day that it's not too shocking anymore. But listen to his opening and imagine that you come from an era when stories usually had a moral. And if we heard about the wrongdoings of a character, there was usually some other character to frame that narrative, to come in and to tell us what was the right thing and what should be prayed for afterwards. But here's how Edgar Allan Poe starts, with no context from any other character. True, nervous, very, very dreadfully nervous I had been and am. But why will you say that I am mad? The disease had sharpened my senses, not destroyed, not dulled them. Above all was the sense of hearing acute. I heard all things in the heaven and in the earth. I heard many things in hell. Wow, that's a hell of an opening. So at the end of this story by Poe, right when you expect that finally somebody will come in and kind of tell you what's right to think about here, nothing like that happens. The narrator, who it turns out is a killer, tears up the floorboards and points out to the cops that there's the corpse that he dismembered and hid under the floorboards. It's absolutely shocking for 1843, even though, as I say, it got to be way more common, and now we're not too shocked by that. This is a great story that Poe wrote, I think, to kind of understand the psychology of the most extreme evil and violent acts that human beings do. And he was inspired by killing of his own era, at least the scholars tell us, and also by an older story that had been written about before by other famous writers like Charles Brockton Brown. We'll talk about that one someday. But this unreliable narrator business is something that horror writers, of course, were the ones who especially followed this up. And that brings me to another item on my list, which is The Horla by Guy de Maupassant. Horla, Horla. Seemed, from what I'm told, I don't read French, but from what I'm told, implies an outlaw or an outlier of some sort. So, here's a little bit of how this story begins. May 8th. What a lovely day. I have spent all the morning lying in the grass in front of my house, under the enormous plane tree that shades the whole of it. I like this part of the country, and I like to live here because I am attached to it by old associations, by those deep and delicate roots which attach a man to the soil on which his ancestors were born and died, which attach him to the ideas and usages of the place, as well as to the food, to local expressions, to the peculiar twang of the peasants, to the smell of the soil, of the villages, and of the atmosphere itself. So you can see this is completely the opposite of Poe's opening, in that it's comforting and it's pleasant, and it gives you no hint in that opening journal entry that things are going to go very badly. So whereas with Poe's narrator, you know that you end up knowing, well, you begin knowing that he's crazy, and you end knowing that he did something atrocious. With Maupassant, it's a gradual realization. In another video, I've mentioned how Maupassant ranked Poe as not as good as his idol Turgenev. But Maupassant also really appreciated Poe and took a lot of technique from him. The Horla told slowly through journal entries, and it's up to us to wonder what's going on with this guy. This is also a descendant of a story by Fitzjames O'Brien called What Was It? Some of the early stories to deal with the question of invisible monsters. Okay, so much for our unreliable narrators. Now let's go to Dracula's Guest. This is a story by Bram Stoker. I'm switching back and forth between anthologies, by the way. And now I'm going into the classic horror collection from Sirius Press. Sirius like the star. Dracula's Guest by Bram Stoker. This is another one that's told in the form of a journal, and it's the journal of Jonathan Harker. I don't think he's even named in this story, but this was the first chapter of Dracula, and it was cut. And later, Stoker's widow published it along with other stories in a collection that was titled Dracula's Guest. And Florence Stoker's account of why it was cut, I think, was for length. That doesn't exactly make sense because Dracula's, it is actually a very long novel, but not especially long for its time period. And I would guess that the editor probably talked Bram Stoker into cutting this because it confuses and complicates the plot. But there's a very interesting story going on here that you, as a modern reader, you can't see unless you kind of get a little background reading to figure it out. But Stoker began Dracula as a sequel to the great novella Carmilla by Sheridan Le Fanu, a great vampire novella. And eventually Stoker found what he thought was an even better person to serve as his vampire, which was this historical figure of Vlad the Impaler. And so he made some changes. But in this first chapter, that's no longer a part of Dracula, he has essentially Dracula encounters Carmilla and defeats her and shows that he's even a stronger vampire than she was. And all of this is witnessed by Jonathan Harker, his the first victim of his that we meet in the novel. And Harker doesn't know what's going on. So as you read this, you won't know what's going on unless you have that little tip in advance. So here's my favorite way to read this story. First, read Carmilla, which is a great novella. Some say the very best vampire story ever. And then you read Dracula's Guest and treat it as the first chapter of Dracula, and then go straight into Dracula and just read it through as if this was part of that novel. And by doing that, you get kind of the maximum vampire action, kind of the maximum extended universe of vampire interaction. As a story in itself, I would say this is just kind of middling. It's fun enough to read, not a great piece of literature, but the associations with Dracula make it fun to visit. Okay, so there are three of our pieces. The next one I want to mention is The Old Nurse's Story by Elizabeth Gaskell. And I'll switch back to this other anthology I've been using. This is Classic Ghost Stories, one of many anthologies with that title. This particular one is from Arcturus Press and edited by Robin Brockman. Elizabeth Gaskell, The Old Nurse's Story. Elizabeth Gaskell is just a tremendous Victorian writer, maybe the very best Victorian fiction writer. I'm not sure how far I want to defend that because there's so many great ones, but she wrote terrific novels, terrific short stories and novellas, and most of them were not in the genre that I'm talking about here, the horror genre. She was sort of coaxed into writing horror by Charles Dickens, who was an editor, and he found it profitable to run Christmas editions of the magazines that he owned. And at that time, the ghost story was strongly associated with Christmas. And, you're gathered for Christmas with your loved ones, and it's a cold winter night when sports are not necessarily available to you, outdoor activities, but staying inside around a fire and telling scary stories was something you could definitely do. Or reading scary stories from these magazines that Dickens sold. So he coerced Mrs. Gaskell, as she was attributed in the magazines, into writing ghost stories. And he did more than that. There's a story of hers called The Crooked Branch that he imported into one of his themed anthologies, where it was set in a haunted house and every room in the house had its own story. Her story had nothing to do with ghosts. It was just this tragedy of an elderly couple with a reprobate son who caused them a lot of misery. It's a devastating story, not at all supernatural, except that Dickens took it upon himself to write an introduction that framed it as a ghost story. So that's a great story, except for the part that Dickens added. But this is a story that Mrs. Gaskell wrote herself in response to Dickens's suggestion that she submit a ghost story to him. Of course, she wanted the payday, and she felt very unequal to the genre. She wasn't that familiar with it, wasn't a fan, didn't quite know how to build the story, and you can actually see that in the ending of this story, where basically somebody comes on and sort of tells you what the theme is in case you didn't get it. So it's a little clumsy in the ending, but along the way it's just a tremendous story with great depth of psychology, wonderful character interactions, and a scary as hell scene of a ghost child at the window. I'll read you just a little bit of the opening here so you can see how this one is set up. It's the old nurse herself speaking in her own voice, telling the story. And she's telling it to the children that she takes care of. You know, my dears, that your mother was an orphan and an only child, and I dare say you have heard that your grandfather was a clergyman up in Westmoreland, where I come from. I was just a girl in the village school when, one day, your grandmother came in to ask the mistress if there were any scholar there who would do for a nursemaid. So that's how she gets the job with this house full of fancy pants people, and ends up in the ghost story. It also gives you just a little hint of what I think is great about Gaskell. One thing I think is great about her, which is that she's interested in and knowledgeable about and terrifically skillful in portraying the lives of people of different social classes. This is not one of those novels where you're supposed to worship the rich people and the servants are just there to carry out little plot points. This is a story that has a wonderful feel for different people in different classes, certainly for women as well as for men, and does a wonderful job of portraying their inner lives. Okay, so that was The Old Nurse's Story by Elizabeth Gaskell, and that leaves me one that I want to talk about for today, and this is by Robert Louis Stevenson, the famous Robert Louis Stevenson. And his most famous story, of course, is The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. And that's not only his most famous work in horror, but his most famous work overall. He wrote so much great stuff in a lot of genres, in novels, short stories, poetry. But this story, that's among the most anthologized, is The Body Snatcher. And it's about the old practice of robbing graves in order to get anatomical specimens for the training of medical students. So it's inherently some gruesome material, and Stevenson makes some explicit references to real-life body snatchers, Burke and Hare, and Dr. Knox, who employed them. And his characters are acquainted with those and engaged in the same pursuit. The writing here is extraordinary. The prose, page by page, is among the best you'll find. So here's the opening paragraph that I think is beautiful. Every night in the year, 4 of us sat in the small parlor of the George at Debenham. the undertaker and the landlord and Fettus and myself. Sometimes there would be more, but blow high, blow low, come rain or snow or frost, we four would be each planted in his own particular armchair. Fettus was an old, drunken Scotsman, a man of education obviously, and a man of some property since he lived in idleness. He had come to Debenham years ago, while still young, and by a mere continuance of living had grown to be an adopted townsman. His blue camlet cloak was a local antiquity, like the church spire. His place in the parlour at the George, his absence from church, his old, crapulous, disreputable vices, were all things of course in Debenham. He had some vague radical opinions and some fleeting infidelities, which he would now and again set forth and emphasize with tottering slaps upon the table. He drank rum, 5 glasses regularly every evening, and for the greater portion of his nightly visit to the George sat, with his glass in his right hand, in a state of melancholy alcoholic saturation. We called him the doctor, for he was supposed to have some special knowledge of medicine, and had been known upon a pinch to set a fracture or reduce a dislocation. But beyond these slight particulars, we had no knowledge of his character and antecedents. And then, of course, the story tells us about his character and antecedents. So, great story by Robert Louis Stevenson, one of the best ghost stories ever. And that concludes my list of the 5th through 10th most anthologized ghost stories. Thanks for listening.